Before stepping into the execution chamber, each death row inmate has the right to request their last meal. But is this their final moment to savor life? Or just a symbolic gesture? Some inmates choose lavish meals, with extravagant dishes, as if trying to enjoy the final moments of their life. But not everyone follows this path. Some opt for strange meals, carrying cryptic meanings, or refuse all food, choosing to depart in complete silence. Their last meal could be a reminder of the days gone by, or simply a reaction to the death that is drawing near. And after the meal, they leave their last words, maybe words of remorse, or challenging remarks, defying their fate. Today, we'll explore the strange last meals and the final words of the most infamous death row inmates. These individuals not only haunt us with the crimes they committed, but also with the way they faced death, and the choices they made in their final moments. If you enjoy chilling crime stories and intriguing details, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss the next videos. 1. John Wayne Gacy. On May 10, 1994, at the Illinois State Penitentiary, John Wayne Gacy walked into the execution chamber. He showed no fear, no remorse. His cold indifference sent a shiver down the spines of those who witnessed the moment. Gacy was far from an ordinary murderer. He was a monster hidden behind a facade of normalcy. Once a successful businessman with a construction company, he was a well-respected member of his community. He even participated in social activities, donning the costume of Pogo the Clown to entertain children. But behind that friendly exterior lay a terrifying secret. From 1972 to 1978, Gacy lured and murdered at least 33 young men and teenagers. He would promise them work or invite them over to his home. But once they fell into his trap, they were tortured and strangled to death. Not only did Gacy steal their lives, but he also went to great lengths to cover up his crimes by burying the bodies beneath his floorboards. When the police searched his home, they discovered 26 bodies buried under the ground, 3 others in the yard, and 4 dumped into the Des Plaines River, transforming his house into a vast graveyard. It remains one of the most haunting crime scenes in American history. In 1978, police began suspecting Gacy after a 15-year-old boy went missing. Upon investigation, they found that Gacy had been the last person to meet with the victim. When a search warrant was executed, the horrifying evidence beneath his floorboards confirmed their suspicions. Gacy was arrested and brought to trial, but he showed no signs of remorse. He attempted to use insanity as his defense, but no one believed him. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before sentencing him to death. On the day of his execution, Gacy requested a final meal consisting of 12 fried shrimp, a bucket of KFC fried chicken, French fries, and strawberries, Diet Coke. This was no accident. Before his arrest, Gacy had managed 3 KFC restaurants. It was likely his way of reminding himself of a time when he was free and respected, before he became a notorious killer. After finishing his meal, Gacy was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any last words, he responded with a defiant challenge. "Kiss my ass. No remorse. No fear." However, the process of administering the lethal injection was not as smooth as planned. The injection system malfunctioned, causing him to endure nearly 20 minutes of agonizing pain before his body ceased to function. It was a tragic end for a man who had taken so many lives. Once he died, the house where he had committed his heinous crimes was completely demolished to erase the haunting traces of his dark past. But the name John Wayne Gacy lives on, etched in history as one of the most chilling serial killers in American history. A perfect example of brutality hidden behind a flawless facade. Ted Bundy. On January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison, Ted Bundy walked into the execution chamber. His face, once filled with confidence and charm, was now devoid of those familiar expressions. For the first time, he couldn't control the situation, and he couldn't manipulate anyone. Death was near. Before we discuss that final moment, let's take a step back to the story that led him here. Bundy was not your average killer. He was handsome, intelligent, and had an uncanny ability to gain people's trust. It was this charm that made it impossible for anyone to suspect that behind that friendly smile was one of the deadliest serial killers in United States history. From 1974 to 1978, Bundy went on a killing spree, taking the lives of at least 30 women across the country, from Washington to Utah, Colorado, and Florida. His method was to approach victims pretending to be injured, sometimes using crutches or a cast, asking for help. Once they were vulnerable, he would strike, overpower them, and take them to remote locations. But his crimes didn't stop there. Bundy revisited crime scenes and interacted with the bodies of his victims, a sign of profound psychological disturbance. He targeted women with similar physical traits. Young, long-haired women, often with parted hair in the middle. Investigators believed he was obsessed with a specific type. Perhaps the kind of woman he once loved or the one who had rejected him. In 1975, Bundy was arrested after police discovered tools he used to restrain his victims in his car. But due to lack of concrete evidence, he was only temporarily charged. In 1977, exploiting security lapses, he escaped from custody twice, committing 2 horrific attacks on female college students in Florida. After being recaptured in 1978, Bundy's trial became the first criminal trial in United States history to be broadcast nationally. He defended himself in court, attempting to manipulate public opinion with his confident demeanor and charming smile. However, all his efforts failed. The evidence was overwhelming, and a surviving witness identified him. The jury took just 7 hours to sentence him to death. On the day of his execution, Bundy did not request a special last meal. According to the rules, the Florida prison provided him with a standard meal, which included a steak, fried eggs, toast with butter, milk, and orange juice. He didn't touch a single item. Gone were the days of confidence and arrogance. Bundy became a nervous wreck, knowing that this time, he couldn't escape. No tricks, no charm left to manipulate anyone. After rejecting his final meal, he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any last words, he simply said, "Please give my love to my family and friends." A calm statement, but filled with contradiction, considering that in all the years prior, he had never shown love or compassion for anyone, especially his victims. As the 2,000-volt current surged through his body, Bundy convulsed, gripping the chair tightly, before his body slowly became still. A man who had terrorized the nation had finally met his end. After his execution, crowds gathered outside the prison, cheering and celebrating, even setting off fireworks, waving banners, and throwing a party. For them, Bundy's death was a fitting punishment. Although he was gone, Ted Bundy's name continues to haunt America. He became one of the most infamous serial killers in history, a symbol of the dark side of charm and psychological manipulation. 3. Timothy McVeigh. On June 11, 2001, at Terre Haute Federal Prison in Indiana, Timothy McVeigh entered the execution chamber. He showed no fear, no remorse. He was calm, as if everything that was about to happen had been preordained. But before we dive into his final moment, let's look back at the crime that led him to this fate. McVeigh was not a serial killer like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy. He didn't target individual victims. Instead, he attacked an entire city with a terrifying bombing that killed 168 people, including 19 children, and left over 600 others injured. The attack took place on the morning of April 19, 1995, at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. McVeigh parked a truck filled with 2,300 kilograms of homemade explosives right outside the building, set a timer, and walked away. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated, leveling much of the building and causing massive destruction. It was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the U.S. before the September 11, 2001 attacks. McVeigh wasn't killing for money or personal vendettas, his motive was extreme ideology. He had served in the U.S. Army and participated in the Gulf War. But after leaving the military, he grew disillusioned with the government, believing that the federal authorities were oppressing citizens and stripping away their freedoms, especially after the 1993 standoff between the FBI and the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. McVeigh saw himself as a warrior against the government, taking revenge with the bombing. After the explosion, McVeigh didn't run far. Just 90 minutes later, he was arrested for not having a license plate and carrying an illegal firearm. Once the police identified him as the primary suspect in the bombing, the investigation quickly came to a close. His trial began in 1997. McVeigh showed no remorse, even comparing the children who died in the bombing to collateral damage in war, a cold statement that infuriated the nation. The jury took only 3 days to sentence him to death. On the day of the execution, McVeigh did not request an extravagant or lavish last meal. He chose only one item: mint chocolate chip ice cream. That was it. No steak, no wine, no meal to reflect a desire to savor his final moments. Just a bowl of ice cream, cold, much like the man himself. After finishing the ice cream, he was escorted to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, he didn't say anything. However, he left a note with the quote from the poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley. "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." At 7:14 a.m., the lethal injection began to flow into McVeigh's body. He didn't struggle, didn't speak a word, just closed his eyes and slowly drifted into death. A man who had caused one of the most horrific bombings in American history, the one before the tragedy of 9/11, was gone without showing a trace of remorse. Outside, over 300 relatives of the victims watched the execution live. Some felt relieved, but others thought his death was too easy a fate for him. Timothy McVeigh is dead, but the Oklahoma City bombing remains an open wound in U.S. history that will never heal. 4. Aileen Wuornos. On October 9, 2002, at Florida State Prison, Aileen Wuornos walked into the execution chamber. She showed no tears, no pleading, no fear. For her, death seemed more like a release than a punishment. But before we talk about her final moments, let's take a look back at the tumultuous life that led Wuornos to this fate. Aileen Wuornos was not your typical serial killer. She did not hunt victims for pleasure or for some twisted psychological reason. She killed to survive. Born into a family filled with violence, abandoned by her father, and abused by her grandparents, Aileen fell into a life on the streets from a very young age. She turned to prostitution to survive and eventually became a homeless drifter. The years of wandering turned her into a bitter, mistrustful person, one who was ready to strike when she felt threatened. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos killed 7 men, most of whom were clients she met while working as a prostitute. Her statements about the killings were inconsistent. At times she said she killed in self-defense after being attacked, while at other times she admitted to the killings coldly. Wuornos's capture happened fairly quickly. When the police found one of the victims' cars abandoned, they discovered her fingerprints. From there, they traced items belonging to the victim that she had pawned, and Wuornos's fingerprints were found on them. She was arrested in January 1991. Initially, Wuornos denied all the charges but later confessed to everything. The trial took place in 1992, and it took the jury only 2 hours to sentence her to death. On the day of her execution, Wuornos did not request a special last meal. She simply asked for a black coffee. Some experts believe this was a sign of rejection, as if she did not want to enjoy the final moments. Not needing food, not wanting to feel anything more. After finishing her coffee, Wuornos was escorted to the execution chamber. When asked if she had any last words, she said something cryptic. "I'll be back, like the day of independence with Jesus Christ." No one truly understood what Wuornos meant. Did she believe in reincarnation? Did she see herself as a supernatural figure? Or was it just an unsettling phrase she left behind for the world? At 9:47 a.m., the lethal injection began to flow into Wuornos' body. She did not struggle, nor did she resist. She closed her eyes, and her body slowly became still. When the sentence was carried out, prison staff described her passing as strange, like she had been ready for it all along. After Wuornos passed away, many psychologists continued to study her mindset. Some believe she genuinely killed in self-defense, while others argue that Wuornos became a killer because she had lost trust in humanity, viewing men as enemies, and was willing to strike first before they had the chance to harm her. Whatever the reason, Aileen Wuornos remains one of the most infamous female serial killers in history. And her last words, ambiguous but haunting, remain an unsolved mystery. 5. Ronnie Lee Gardner. On June 18, 2010, at Utah State Prison, Ronnie Lee Gardner entered the execution chamber. He did not plead for mercy, did not show fear, and did not speak a single word. But before he faced the firing squad, let's take a look at the crime that led him to this moment. Gardner had a childhood marked by violence and poverty, and he quickly became involved in crime, spending much of his life in and out of prison. His most serious crime occurred in 1985, when he was on trial for a murder committed during a robbery. In the Salt Lake County courtroom, Gardner seized a hidden firearm and opened fire right there in the courtroom. He killed attorney Michael Burdell and injured a guard before being subdued. Sentenced to death, Gardner was given the option to choose his method of execution, as his sentence had been handed down before 2004. He chose a firing squad, a rare choice in the U.S., citing that he wanted to die like a warrior. This decision sparked significant controversy. Nevertheless, Utah was required by law to carry out the execution. After Gardner's case, Utah officially abolished the firing squad as a standard method of execution, with exceptions only in special circumstances. Gardner's last meal request included lobster tail, steak, an apple, vanilla ice cream. He also requested to watch the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy during his final meal. The final moments. Gardner was strapped to a wooden chair, with 5 marksmen positioned 7 meters away from him. A white cloth marked the spot over his heart. Before the command to fire was given, Gardner simply shook his head and said, "I have nothing to say." 5 bullets were fired simultaneously. Gardner became the last death row inmate in Utah to be executed by firing squad. 6. Stephen Wayne Anderson. On January 29, 2002, at San Quentin State Prison in California, Stephen Wayne Anderson entered the execution chamber. Before he departed, he left behind an apology. But given the horrors he had caused, was there anyone who truly accepted it? Born in 1953, Anderson's life was steeped in crime from a very young age. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in Utah for hired murder. But instead of accepting his sentence, he escaped from prison in 1979. After his escape, he did not choose to live in hiding but continued his criminal activities. He broke into homes to steal, and if the homeowner discovered him, he would kill them immediately to cover his tracks. 1 year later, on the night of May 8, 1980, Anderson sneaked into the home of 81-year-old Elizabeth Lyman, who lived alone in California. He intended to rob her, but when he saw her wake up, he shot her in the head without hesitation. However, what made this case particularly chilling was Anderson's cold demeanor afterward. He didn't flee immediately. Instead, he calmly sat down at her dining table, made a light meal, read a newspaper, and searched for valuables. While he was taking precious items, he had no idea that the police had discovered traces and were surrounding the house. He was caught at the scene, with the gun still hot in his hand. With undeniable evidence, his trial proceeded quickly. Anderson confessed to the crime but still attempted to seek a reduced sentence by claiming he did not intend to kill Mrs. Lyman. It was just a panic-driven act. This argument did not convince the jury. He had killed before. He had escaped prison to continue committing crimes. And this time, he murdered an innocent elderly woman in her own home. The death sentence was handed down. Anderson was incarcerated for more than 20 years and repeatedly appealed, but to no avail. Before his departure, Anderson did not request a lavish banquet like many other death row inmates. He chose a simple but somewhat strange meal: grilled cheese sandwich, corn, peach pie, chocolate ice cream, beets. On January 29, 2002, Anderson was escorted to the execution chamber. When asked if he wanted to leave a final statement, he did not challenge the situation like many other death row inmates. He simply said, "I am sorry for the pain I caused. But what does this apology truly mean? Would the victim's family accept it?" Anderson was administered lethal injection and passed away within a few minutes. No family members arrived to claim his body. No one mourned. No one waited. 7. Velma Barfield. On November 2, 1984, at the North Carolina Central Prison, Velma Barfield became the first woman to be executed in the U.S. after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. In her final moments, she did not resist or show any fear. Unlike many other death row inmates, Velma quietly apologized and accepted her fate. But before we reach this conclusion, let's look back at the path that led her here. Velma Barfield was born in 1932 and lived a normal life like any other woman. She got married, had children, and lived a life without much distinction. However, after the death of her husband in 1969, everything began to change. She became addicted to painkillers, and her life spiraled out of control, eventually leading her into a life of crime. Initially, Velma borrowed money from family and friends to maintain her addiction. But as her debts mounted, she began to find ways to eliminate people who might demand repayment. Her method was simple but effective: poisoning with arsenic. She started by poisoning her own mother, then moved on to her boyfriend, relatives, and even people she had cared for as a nurse. No one suspected that a small, gentle woman with an innocent appearance could be a killer. Velma's crimes were uncovered only when her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, suddenly died in 1978. Police suspected the unusual death and conducted an autopsy. The results showed that Taylor had been poisoned with arsenic over a long period. When arrested, Velma initially denied all accusations. But when faced with irrefutable evidence, she confessed to killing Taylor and many others before him. Her trial was swift. Velma became the first woman in the U.S. to be sentenced to death after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Before her execution, Velma did not request a lavish or elaborate meal. She simply chose a modest meal: cheese snacks, Coca-Cola. On the day of her execution, Velma was asked if she had any final words. She did not beg for forgiveness, nor did she try to justify her actions. She simply said, "I want to say that I am sorry." But for the families who lost loved ones, did her apology really have any meaning? On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was administered lethal injection, marking the first time in nearly 22 years that a woman had been executed in the U.S. She did not resist, did not scream, she just closed her eyes and waited. After a few minutes, her heartbeat slowed and then stopped. She left this world in silence, but the crimes she committed will never be forgotten. Velma Barfield's case became one of the most famous in U.S. history. 8. Gary Gilmore. 1977, at Utah State Prison. Gary Gilmore became the first person to be executed in the U.S. after the death penalty was reinstated. Unlike many death row inmates who try to delay or appeal their execution until the very last moment, Gilmore actively requested that his execution take place as soon as possible. And in his final moment, he uttered three simple yet defiant words: "Let's do it." But how could a person face death so resolutely? Gary Gilmore was born in 1940 and grew up in a family plagued by dysfunction and violence. His father was an alcoholic who abused his wife and children, while his mother was strict and harsh. From a young age, Gilmore exhibited rebellious behavior, causing trouble and often being expelled from school. As a teenager, he began stealing, fighting, and frequently entering juvenile detention centers. In 1962, he was sentenced to 15 years for armed robbery but served just under 13 years before being released. Instead of starting anew, Gilmore returned to his criminal ways within months. In just 2 days in July 1976, Gilmore murdered 2 men in 2 consecutive robberies in Utah. The first incident, he shot and killed gas station attendant Max Jensen, who was surrendering. The second, the following day, he murdered hotel owner Benny Bushnell in a similar manner. There was no other motive than greed and senseless violence. But Gilmore wasn't a sophisticated killer. He was quickly apprehended due to leaving behind a trail of evidence. Just a few months later, he was sentenced to death. While most death row inmates try to delay their executions, Gilmore was different. Immediately after being sentenced, he refused any further appeals and demanded that his execution take place immediately. He declared, "I want to die. I don't want to live in prison for the rest of my life." His family, human rights groups, and even President Jimmy Carter all called for a delay. But Gilmore remained firm in his decision. The Utah court granted his request, making him the first person executed in the U.S. after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Before the execution, Gilmore requested a meal consisting of a hamburger, boiled eggs, French fries, coffee, and 3 shots of hard liquor. On January 17, 1977, Gilmore was led to the execution chamber. He chose a firing squad, a method that had long been discontinued but was still legal in Utah. Tied to a chair, Gilmore stared directly at the 5 marksmen, who aimed at his chest. When asked if he had any final words, he didn't hesitate. He simply said one short, defiant sentence: "Let's do it." And those were his final words. Immediately afterward, a volley of bullets rang out, ending the life of Gary Gilmore. Gilmore's death became a shocking event, marking the return of the death penalty in the U.S. Strangely enough, his name became associated with one of the most famous slogans in the world. 9. Peter Kürten. On July 2, 1931, at Cologne Prison, Germany, Peter Kürten walked into the execution chamber. He showed no fear. He didn't plead for mercy. Instead, he seemed excited about his own death. When asked if he had any final words, he simply smiled and said, "After my head is severed, I will be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood flowing from my neck. That will be my last pleasure." This was not just a statement. It was proof of a twisted mind, a monster wearing the guise of a man. Peter Kürten was born in 1883 and grew up in an extremely poor and violent family. His father was an alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children, and was even arrested for molesting his own daughter. Kürten lived in terror throughout his childhood, and from an early age, he exhibited disturbing signs. At 9 years old, he began torturing animals, deriving pleasure from witnessing the blood flow. At 13, he committed his first murder, pushing a schoolmate into a river just to watch him struggle. As an adult, he was constantly in and out of prison for theft, assault, and arson. But all of this was just the beginning. By the late 1920s, in the city of Düsseldorf, Germany, a series of horrifying attacks and murders occurred. Women were repeatedly stabbed with scissors. Children went missing, only to be found later with horrific wounds. Many victims had been bitten, their blood drained from their bodies. The police were completely stumped, as the killer had no fixed pattern, leaving no clear evidence behind. He killed anyone, from men and women to children, simply to satisfy his bloodlust. In 1930, Peter Kürten voluntarily turned himself into the police. Not because of remorse. Not because of a guilty conscience. But because he wanted to enjoy the attention. He casually confessed to everything, describing in detail each murder and every moment of pleasure he felt when seeing blood. At his trial, he showed no signs of remorse. When sentenced to death by guillotine, he did not object. He was merely curious about the sensation of being decapitated. On the night before his execution, Kürten requested a final meal, which included Wiener Schnitzel, breaded veal cutlet, Austrian style, French fries, white wine. A luxurious meal for that time. But with someone so obsessed with blood and death, could he really have enjoyed the meal? Or was he just waiting for his final pleasure? On July 2, 1931, Kürten stepped up to the guillotine. He did not tremble. He did not beg for mercy. He simply asked one question. After my head is severed, will I be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood flowing from my neck? That will be my last pleasure. And right after that, the blade fell. Peter Kürten's case became one of the most horrifying criminal cases of the 20th century. It raises the question, is a monster born, or is it made by humans? Regardless of the reason, Kürten will forever remain one of the most brutal killers in history. An icon of terror, of an obsession with blood and death. 10. Thomas J. Grasso, on March 20, 1995, at Oklahoma State Prison. Thomas J. Grasso walked into the execution chamber. He did not cry. He did not beg for mercy. However, his final words were not an apology or a reference to the crimes he committed. I didn't get my SpaghettiOs. I want the press to know this. Not a single ounce of remorse. Just a complaint about his last meal. In 1990, in New York, Grasso strangled an 87-year-old woman with a Christmas light cord, just to steal $12 and an old television. After committing the crime, he fled to Oklahoma. Less than a year later, he killed an 81-year-old man, this time using a metal pipe from the victim's fireplace. The motive? To steal $150 and a VHS player. 2 brutal murders, all for small sums of money. He showed no guilt or fear when arrested. He simply laughed, boasted about his crimes, and even mocked the voice of his victim as they were dying. The trial was quick, and the death sentence was handed down, with no chance for Grasso to escape justice. When given the opportunity to request a last meal, Grasso chose an extravagant menu: 24 steamed clams, 2 cheeseburgers, 6 sausages, a pepperoni pizza, a bowl of spaghetti with meat sauce, 2 liters of cola, a box of ice cream, a tray of strawberries, a mango. But there was one problem. He wanted SpaghettiOs. The famous canned pasta in the US. The prison served spaghetti with meat sauce, but not SpaghettiOs. And that was what irritated him. On March 20, 1995, Grasso was led to the lethal injection chamber. When asked if he had any final words, he did not apologize to the victims' families. He did not mention the crimes he had committed. He simply said, "I didn't get my SpaghettiOs. I want the press to know this." No one could believe that a man about to die would spend his last moments complaining about food. After the needle was inserted into his arm, Grasso lost consciousness within 6 minutes. He passed away silently, without saying another word. As we've seen today, the last meals and final words of these notorious death row inmates reveal much about their complex personalities, their final moments of reflection, or sometimes, their challenge to death itself. Every choice, whether a lavish banquet, a cryptic last word, or complete refusal, serves as a haunting reminder of the ultimate end they faced. But in the end, these stories show us that, regardless of how they face death, the legacy of these individuals is forever etched in history. Their actions, choices, and words continue to provoke thought and reflection. What does this say about us as a society, when we are both captivated and haunted by these final moments? Are we seeking closure, understanding, or simply the opportunity to witness justice in its most raw form? Thank you for watching today's video. If you found this video intriguing, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of these final choices made by these individuals? We'd love to hear your opinions. Stay tuned for upcoming videos, and we'll see you in the next one.